begin. So welcome everyone. So glad you can join us today in this crucial conversation on social emotional learning for prevention, substance use, and SEL Forum. On this online workshop, we'll share resources to inform and educate you so you can advocate for kids in your community, because knowledge gives you power to protect kids from substance abuse. We'll also talk about how coping skills, good decision-making, and healthy relationships can prevent drug use in teens. Well, we will focus on marijuana during this forum, since it is the most pressing substance use and abuse, obviously along with alcohol. Some housekeeping tidbits for you. We will send you all the follow-up resources, the slide deck, the recording, and the certificate for your workshop completion. We'll take questions throughout the forum. You can write them in the chat. If I can get to them, I will. If not, we will run through them during the Q&A session at the end. I'm Kym Myers. I've been with Generation Schools Network for 2 years and have 30 years experience working in education and child development. Ellen Sarkisian is also with us today. I think I said that wrong, Ellen, sorry. She's in the background today, handling the chat and all things technical. If you're not familiar with Generation Schools, we are a nonprofit working across the country for the past 16 years, supporting schools and districts in co-creating healthy ecosystems. We work in 4 areas: leadership and improvement, redesign and innovation, college and career readiness, and health and wellness, which we're going to talk about today. We have 2 awesome guest speakers for you today: Julie Dreifaldt from One Chance to Grow Up, and Dr. Jessie Hinckley from CU Anschutz. Let me introduce Julie to you. Julie Dreifaldt has been with One Chance to Grow Up for 4 years and serves as the donor and community liaison. She works closely with foundations and supporters, as well as parents, educators, trusted adults, and community members who care about kids, our country's most important resource and our future. She serves on Cherry Creek School District's parent information network called the PIN, on their board, and the Community Vaping Prevention Roundtable. She tirelessly advocates for kids and encourages and equips adults to have that conversation with kids in their lives, because they do listen and that conversation matters. Julie speaks nationally to parents, trusted adults, and school organizations about today's marijuana and the impacts on kids. Julie is married with 3 teenagers, all who went through the Cherry Creek School District. So Julie, who is One Chance to Grow Up, and what do you do for kids?
Well, first of all, Kym, I really want to thank you for the kind introduction. I thank you, Generation Schools Network, for allowing us to speak about this important topic and caring about our kids. And I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. It means a lot. As Kym said, I have 3 teenagers, which makes me an expert because they always listen to me. They never make bad decisions, and they really think I'm pretty awesome. Not. So parenting has been very humbling, especially during these COVID days. So, but it's been wonderful and difficult and tragic. But I'm a huge advocate of the public school system, so I really appreciate you coming alongside of our kids during these difficult times. So thank you. Real fast, the presentation's twofold. I'm going to be covering the potencies and the products about today's marijuana, and a little bit of our policy work that we do, if that is of interest to anyone. And then I will turn the reins over to Dr. Jessie Hinckley, who will share the latest research and why THC matters and the devastating impacts of cannabis on our adolescent brain. So a little bit about who One Chance to Grow Up is. We formed originally as Smart Colorado in 2012 after marijuana was legalized in Colorado. We were asked to join the government's task force, and we thought we were going to kind of be like, okay, well, here we go. But during the government task force meetings, they were trying to figure out the ease for the American or cannabis consumer and how to regulate marijuana in this new landscape, as Colorado was the first. And sadly, public health and kids' safety was ranked dead last of the priorities. So we realized somebody needed to be in this space to protect our kids. So we formed Smart Colorado to put kids' futures and public safety at the helm, and really in everyone's mind eye right there. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan. We have about 10,000 members and a staff of 6, plus we employ, explore many people that can help us do professional testimony whenever we need. We have an amazing group of people that we work with. We're funded by everyday citizens and some small and large foundations. We do not take any tax marijuana revenue. And why I'm not calling us Smart Colorado is about 1.5 years ago, we transitioned to One Chance to Grow Up as the legal landscape of cannabis regulation and marijuana commercialization has just swept the country. So we get calls, probably 20 to 30 calls a week on different organizations across the country and across the world about how we can help protect kids in our communities regarding this. And I do want to set the record straight. We're not talking about legalization. We're really talking about the impacts of this product on the kids. We're not talking about adult use. We're not talking about pros and cons. I do want to clarify that today, I personally call this marijuana. It's called many things. It's called weed, pot, ganja, MJ, whatever we're talking about, but we call it marijuana because that's how it was legalized in Amendment 64, and that's how it's written into the Colorado law. But to be honest, we're talking about the psychoactive component called THC, which we'll learn a lot about today. That's the chemical that we're concerned about in the adolescent brain. So thank you for being here and listening. So why do we do this? Kym, this is our why. This little boy, this is a 420 festival. And if you're not familiar with that is, that's a day of celebration, April 20th, where thousands and thousands of people gather throughout the country. This was at it's Denver Civic Park a couple years ago. And this picture was on the cover of the Denver Post. And this boy, this really sums it up. I could probably stop here. And this is why we're here, because this little boy is surrounded by plumes of smoke and no one is advocating for him. So we take the steps backwards and get into the regulatory process to protect kids like this.
Tell us about your policy work, Julie, what you've done recently.
So this is a little bit old. This is a 8-year program. So again, or initiative that we did. So this is a great analysis of how we've combined policy and education. So we're educating with a billboard. This billboard has gone national exposure and international. We've seen pictures of it in Australia. They've worked with us getting the artwork. So it's really just a way to combine the policy work of what we do with education. So that's one example. You can keep going a little bit further. This board right here really helped us get potency. So as many of you know, you've heard it's not the same marijuana as your parents. It's not the same marijuana that you used in college. It's not your grandmother's marijuana, whatever it is. So this education campaign really kicked off all the changes that One Chance to Grow Up helped get in law. So really fast, and things that really affected our kids, getting 26 bills that we had impact on over the last 10 years, included product labeling, warning labels, markings on the packaging, child resistant packaging, pregnancy warnings that have to be in every dispensary, potency studies. We helped defer money, I think it was $3 million, to get 150 additional behavioral health specialists in schools. So we really try to make sure when the money comes in, however it comes in, it is funded it goes through the schools, and potency studies. So this really also helped identify again, part of the education is marijuana a hard drug. It's not the same drug, and we'll have some slides later that goes over that. So it's a clarification of what the difference of yesterday's drug is to today. And then the next, go ahead. The next slide I just really want to share, I think, is what we've done. This slide, this was from last summer, and I'm really proud of this. Dr. Hinckley helped testify in this case. So this was House Bill 1317. And you can see Governor Polis, you can see me, my yellow pants. This article made People Magazine. So I was in People Magazine, very impressive. But we had hundreds and hundreds of people that helped get this happen. So we had several youth serving organizations. We had the United Way, we had Children's Hospital, we had the Colorado Medical Society that really came behind this and helped make this happen. So briefly, and if policy is not your thing, I totally get that, but this helps what your schools look like. So in a really quick 3,000 foot overview, it helped get THC Potency reviewed, which is currently happening at the University of Colorado, the School of Public Health. So there's 60,000 research articles that very intelligent people are reviewing along with artificial intelligence to make sure that we can kind of come up with a recommendation of what potency really should be in these products. They are tracking the medical marijuana system more like medicine. So it is not, there's some safeguards around that for kids. This bill required a toxicology and data collection for all unnatural deaths and suicides under the age of 25. Because right now, THC is the #1 substance found in completed suicides in Colorado kids. And most importantly, and I won't get into all the weeds on this, if you're interested, Ellen's going to put a video in the chat, or feel free to reach out to me. But this bill made it much more difficult for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds to access a med card, or a red card, you might have heard it called. So that therefore reducing the available extra marijuana that they would purchase in copious amounts. And our children are very innovative, so they started bringing it to their schools and selling it. So this really closes that loophole, which is very important. So thank you for letting me talk about policy, but it was a bipartisan. Attorney General Phil Weiser was there. We had Democrats, we had Republicans. It was a very strong bill. The boy that you see in the picture is Johnny Stack. He was a Highlands Ranch 17-year-old that unfortunately took his own life after dabbing THC marijuana. And his mother and father have become huge advocates and vocal in this process. So that's that.
Julie, that's great work that you all are doing. Yeah, what are some of the inaccurate messages that kids hear about marijuana today?
So Kym, as you can see from this slide, our kids are seeing, I show this slide because as we know with tobacco and alcohol, the more exposure kids have, the more normalized these products become. So there's a huge difference between decriminalization and legalization, which we did, and then the full-blown profit-driven commercialization that Colorado unfortunately has been the guinea pig for. There are twice as many dispensaries, medical and recreational dispensaries, as there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined, which is a shock.
Colorado.
These are Colorado stats right now.
Yeah.
So it is shocking to see the amount of, I know how many Starbucks and McDonald's I drive by when I go to work. And so and a lot of these dispensaries are in communities at risk. So the false messages our kids hear are, hey man, it's medicine. Like, does it really matter? It's just medicine. What's the problem? They also hear that it's safer than alcohol, which is this. When I pulled this off the web internet, I was kind of shocked. Go ahead, Ellen. It helps, and these are false messages. It helps cure my anxiety. I don't have any more panic attacks with it. It really helps me just chill. Dude, I can't get a DUI when I'm driving high. Not true. No one's ever died from cannabis use. Oh, I've heard this done so many times. It helps me sleep. I can't use it. I can't go to sleep without it. The Green Cross equals pharmacy, equals health, equals wellness. It's organic. It's far from organic. It is a distilled, genetically modified, butane-driven product. So it's just weed. I had an addiction psychiatrist tell me once, he said, we should just call it just weed, because that's what it's referred to by so many people in our state. and it's organic and it's just a plant, which is none of that's true. So you can see why our kids are up against some really tough messaging that they continue to hear as dispensaries are across the state. And to be honest, our media and our parents, I mean, I've talked to multiple parents as a mother of 3 teenagers that I've heard all of these out of their mouths. So really quickly, I'll touch on the potency like we talked about. So in Holland, which is a pretty, I would say, marijuana welcoming country, they observed a lot of negative impacts from the potencies that were rising in their state. So they did some research and they concluded that anything over 15% is a hard drug and should be treated like cocaine. And just for FYI, 93% of the products found in Colorado recreational dispensaries in 2020 were over 15%. So only 7% of the products fall under that 15% hard drug. And those crayons, I mean, I don't think of those as hard drugs, but that's the potencies that are in those, unfortunately have some of that effects on our kids. As you can see on this, marijuana has been around well before 1960. It's been around a long time. And whether you call it cannabis or marijuana, or like I said, any of the other acronyms that people use, it's had a pretty, for the past several decades, it's been pretty steady. 1, 2, 3, 5% THC, it's gone up very mildly. And then you can see when legalization hit, which was in 2012 here in Colorado, there's been an 800, and medical's been around since 2000, just so you see on that frame in Colorado, it had an 800% increase in potency. So we're not even talking about remotely the same product. I work with Dr. Libby Stout, and she said comparing yesterday's marijuana from even from 2000, where there were no concentrates, she compares it, the cocoa leaf to crack cocaine, which is a pretty startling comparison. And THC, we like I said, they're reviewing all this research. But several studies do show that there's problems with this, including sleep problems, suicide ideation, violence, psychosis, addiction, and going forward. So, and Dr. Hinckley will cover some of those as well. So this screen here shows you what psychosis. So, and I will defer to Dr. Hinckley later, but psychosis, from what I understand, is a complete break with what's real. So these kids and adults, I mean, here you can see this study was 18 to 65, people that use over 15% THC, and again, that's 93% of the products in the Colorado market. If they use them, they had a 3 times increased risk of psychosis. And if they use daily use, that increased to 5. And if they were using products less than 5%, there was no associated risk for psychosis. So this is a pretty startling slide for me. And this has resonated with several kids that I've spoken with. You know, they don't want to turn that switch on for mental health crisis.
Julie, this information is just really, really startling. So how are kids using marijuana today?
Well, I'll show you on the next slide, and I'm going to go over some products too so that you can see. So again, this is about the potency. The picture is the joint, the Cheech and Chong joint. You know, Snoop Dogg, I was at a party with a bunch of people this weekend, and they're like, oh my gosh, Snoop's probably so high. And, you know, there's laughter about it. And it's not the same product. So I'm in the middle of that. That's a dab rig. And that is, so dabbing is a consumption, and I have a video that I'll show after this, but let me read this. It's the consumption via vaporizing of ultra concentrated THC resin, which is that kind of orangish thing on the top, and you heat it with a butane torch, and then you ingest the vapors. It's become an epidemic among our Colorado kids. And this epidemic has helped Governor Polis create one of his wildly important goals, was decreasing the prevalence of dabbing as the usual use. So the kids are not smoking it, they're dabbing and vaping it by our high school students. So, and you can see there's products out there, and you can go to the next slide, because I really would love for you to all see what dabbing is. It's a 20-second video, so you can kind of see what we're talking about.
This is dabbing, a more potent and increasingly popular way of using high THC pot. Just a hit is 10 times stronger than a joint or higher. So popular, it's hard to keep up with the nicknames. Honey, honeycomb, shatter, butter. The dab is the gooey or hard substance placed in the glass, then lit with a butane torch. If you want to know more about this, just ask your kids.
It's kind of a harsh way to end, but it's true.
Julie, you told me the other day about, you asked all your kids about it, and their response to you was what? They see.
The perception is, at least, I mean, among my kids, and they go to a public school, is that everybody does it. And I think that's a message that we need to know. According to Healthy Kids Colorado survey, I believe it's 4 out of 5 kids do not imbibe in cannabis use. So I think that's really important to know. I mean, when you're, and I'm sure you all know this working in the schools, but when you say that kid's smoking, they're not talking about nicotine. And smoking, pretty much, from what I understand, from like involves any kind of marijuana. So,
yeah.
So yeah, that's a pretty shocking video. Whoops. There's one more. What? Sorry. There we go. So after 10 years of legalization, there was no standard, and I hate the word serving size because it makes it sound like it's like a food. It's so it's that, but they've called it that for this purposes. So there was no standard serving size for THC concentrate. So because of the bill that I just recently discussed, we helped get, and you can see I just took a picture of it today because the educational resource just came out. So the picture in the middle is what they recommend as a serving size. And the other thing that kind of makes me laugh, not laugh, but what does it say? Vaporizers, heat marijuana concentrate. The serving size should not exceed 1 inhalation lasting 2 seconds. So it's a really random, because I mean, and I went on YouTube and there's so many different ways to inhale that can enhance your experience. So anyways, 1 inhalation lasting 2 seconds is the serving of that. And I have asked kids, you know, how do they use shatter? And 2 kids told me they use it in teaspoons. And that's the serving size. So it's pretty scary, the amount of high THC that some of our kids are ingesting.
Julie, I think you're going to answer this going forward, but how would this be compared to vaping?
Well, vaping is also, most vaping has high THC. The cartridges have over 15%, and a lot of them are 40, 50, 60% THC. So, and the vaping is also a concern too. And Dr. Hinckley will cover that, but there's lung injuries. Anecdotally, I mean, I had a friend from college, her son, he made national news. He started vaping both THC and nicotine, and it destroyed his lungs. And he was the first recipient of a double lung transplant at 17 years old. So his life is forever changed, forever. And I talked to his mom, and she said the twin brother is now dabbing alongside of him. So, you know, kids don't think it's going to happen to them. So that's why this education is really important. So how do we, methods of intake? So from top to bottom, a little tongue in cheek here, we've all played this game. So you can use eye drops. You can put it up your nose with nasal sprays. You can dab it. You can smoke it. You can vape it. You can eat it. And I'm not just talking the brownie anymore. We're talking peanut butter. We're talking jam. You're talking products to make baked goods. You can drink it. I just recently purchased a blue elixir in Maine that had a puppy dog paw on it that was filled with THC. Inhalers, and I'll go over that later. That's a pretty shocking product. You can use lip balms. There's lotions, there's oils, there's tinctures. There's sexual lubricants, and my favorite, suppositories, and you can figure out what we're talking about there. So we created THC Photos initially for media. We wanted, because if you Google, I mean, almost any marijuana or cannabis story in the country that's reported on, 99% of the time they use a picture of the beautiful green leaf. So it's really not an accurate depiction from in the media. So this started out as a media page that we created, but we've really used it to educate policymakers as well as adults, trusted adults, and our parents and schools. So this is a great resource. I highly recommend you take a look at it. We have several different state albums, and you're welcome to use those pictures. Just let us know if you use them, but they're free of charge, and they're great resource for you. So I'll quickly just show a few of the more egregious products we have on there. Excuse me. Here's the inhaler that we talked about. So there's 1,000 milligrams in this inhaler. This was sold on the rec market. I think it was like 98 bucks. And the label peeled right off. My son has asthma, so just for giggles, I took out his albuterol and put it in there. And what do you think? It worked perfectly. So, you know, I just, teachers and parents just need to be super hyperactive, hyperly aware of what your kids have and what they don't have. These are products that I purchased personally in Washington State last summer. And as you can see, we're not talking about brownies. There's cookie dough. That orange creamsicle has 10 servings in that. And it was just a small little soda thing. The peach rings, the rainbow belts, those have been outlawed here in Colorado because they were being sprayed with high THC. There's malt balls. A lot of these products are scary because once you take them out of their packaging, there's no marking. So the kids don't know what they're doing. There's sugar packets, which look like sugar. So this is, I think, a particularly egregious product. This was purchased in Chicago at a recreational dispensary. This is great because it's marked. As you can see, each serving size is marked with 10 milligrams. But I'm a big fan of the Incredibles movie, and I felt like this was kind of really toting the line of really kind of preying on our kids. So the marketing was very upsetting for me and our team at One Chance. These are suckers, beautiful suckers that were purchased that have high THC in them. This is a particularly concerning product because it's a cannabis ring rimmer. They also had a margarita or a Bloody Mary one as well, but it's really mixing alcohol and marijuana and THC, which really is concerning for a drunk driving. Decreases your judgment in behavior. And there's an increased risk in overdose, according to one physician I spoke with. So those are just some products. Again, I highly recommend that you take a look at the website. These products were purchased just a couple months ago. They're crayons, like we talked about. Those pixie sticks are there on the far right side. So you just whip them off and put them in your water and sit in class and get buzzed. So, and then the promises of making you smarter and sexier and happier. Again, these were purchased in the legal market. All the products on there are from the legal recreational markets throughout this country.
It's just astonishing to me. I'm just learning things that I never knew, Julie. I mean, I just can't believe that there's no regulation on the marketing piece. So how is all of this hurting our kids?
Kym, great question. And I think I will defer to Dr. Hinckley on this. He is one of the smartest people I've worked with. He's a huge advocate for our kids in our state. We'll do a quick introduction. Jesse, you're welcome to start sharing your slides now. And so Dr. Jesse Hinckley graduated magna cum laude with his BS in neuroscience from Brigham Young. He graduated from the University of Colorado School of Medicine with both his MD and his PhD in human medical genetics and genomics. Dr. Hinckley is at the University of Colorado. He's extremely accomplished researcher and professor. He completed his general psychiatric residency and child and adolescent psychiatric fellowship there. Dr. Hinckley's primary research Interests include better understanding how and why adolescents transition from experimentation and casual use with substances to problematic substance use and substance use disorders. Dr. Hinckley and his wife are foster parents on top of that, which only adds to his understanding and appreciation of how substances affect teenagers and their brains. So let's hear from Dr. Hinckley. Please join me in welcoming him. I guess, Dr. Hinckley, my first question to you is, what are kids using in Colorado these days?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for having me. Just a standard for someone in academics. I have some research funding. Later on, in response to one question, I will show you one slide of animal data. It will be denoted because I don't want you accidentally telling people they're rats, but I will make sure that that is clear. So one thing that we know, and this has been something that has often been talked about in the debate to legalize cannabis in particular, studies so far have shown that cannabis rates in adolescents, and I'm going to define that as 12 to 17, have not increased since cannabis legalized. And so people will often say, well, it's okay to legalize it, it's not affecting our teenagers. But what I want to show you, this is data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Green are Colorado adolescents aged 12 to 17. Blue are the United States counterparts. And what you can see is, even though rates have remained relatively steady over the past couple of decades, states with legal cannabis have consistently higher adolescent youth rates than states without legal cannabis. However, that's not the whole story. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the brain continues to develop through about age 25. What the top section of this graph shows are young adults aged 18 to 25, who for all intents and purposes are really still adolescents. And what you see here is rates are increasing among young adults who are still undergoing brain development. They're increasing in Colorado, which is red, and in the United States, which is yellow, but that rate of increase is greater in states that have legal cannabis. So it's not fair to say adolescents are not using more. There is some nuance to that statement. While technically correct, it doesn't tell the story. However, and as you can see from what Julie was saying earlier, you know, it's roughly 10% of kids, or a little bit more, that have used cannabis in the last month. And so that's about the rate that we see. However, the question was asked about vaping, and vaping is, I've got to tell you, one of the quickest things to come onto the scene in any lifetime that we've ever seen. So this data is from Monitoring the Future. It shows you vaping rates in the United States among 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. On the left is nicotine, on the right is THC. So the year-over-year increase in nicotine vaping is the highest recorded increase in substance use ever measured. The second highest recorded increase in substance use ever measured is the increase in THC vaping between 2018 and 2019. So in the last 5 years, with vaping nicotine and vaping THC, we have recorded the 2 largest increases in adolescent substance use ever recorded in history. So that gives you an idea of how quickly vaping has come on the scene. And we're probably underestimating vaping by a fair amount. It's extremely, extremely prevalent. A lot of kids don't know if they're vaping nicotine or THC or both. And so I always ask kids, but the reality is they could be vaping any of the above. And so that's important to know. If a teen is vaping, they're not buying it legally. So they might tell you they're vaping, but they're not vaping THC. That doesn't mean that that is necessarily the case. They may not know, or they may know. What we don't know from any of this data is how much teens are using. So we know that roughly the percentage that use, but we don't know how much they're using, because people have a lot of difficulty. You saw from the slides that were put up earlier how variable cannabis products are. Even adults are really terrible at estimating how much cannabis they actually use at one time, and they often don't know how much THC is within what they're using. And so that's just something we don't have a good idea of. Most people who drink alcohol, they can tell you the number of drinks they have, they can tell you what they drink, and you get an idea of how much alcohol it is. Same with cigarettes. People can tell you the number of cigarettes they smoke a day. People really cannot tell you how much cannabis they use or how much they vape. The question was also asked earlier about what's the difference between vaping and and dabbing. And while they can get exposed to, same high level THC, dabbing can expose you to a lot more, a lot quicker. But it has other safety risks. So you saw from the video the use of a butane torch. Imagine a teenager sitting in their closet or in their car or in their bathroom using a butane torch, because what you have to do is you have to flash vaporize solidified THC, and then you inhale the vapors from that. So rather than having a device that does that for you, you're actually doing that with a butane torch and then putting your face down there and actually inhaling those fumes. So we've had burns, we've had fires, we've had all sorts of things that we have seen. And I can tell you from my foster kids, you can order everything you need to build a dabbing rig from Amazon off of the internet, including the butane torch. We've intercepted multiple packages. The other thing that you should know is experimentation. A lot of kids experiment with substances. That doesn't mean they go on to use regularly. We're not great at predicting who will, but experimentation with cannabis is different. So this is data from the Colorado Twin study that we're in the process of publishing. And what you see is that the average age of first use of alcohol and cannabis is about the same. It's about 16 years old. Kids on average experiment with alcohol for about 2.5 years before they become regular drinkers if they're going to drink. But for cannabis, that experimentation period is about 2.5 months. And so when kids start using cannabis, we pretty much assume clinically, if they're experimenting, they're already using regularly, because that window is so short to transition between that. And that's different from any other substance we've seen. In terms of other substances, there's been a trend nationally that all other substance use, except for vaping and cannabis use, have been declining in the United States. That is certainly true in Colorado. So this survey, what this is looking at here in blue, is alcohol use. Solid lines are young adults 18 to 25. Dashed lines are our adolescent friends 12 to 17. So alcohol use, you can see, has been pretty steadily declining. Gray is binge drinking, also steadily declining. And then red is cigarette use, and that has also been declining. So we pretty much have seen that we have consistently had declining substance use, still pretty prevalent. I mean, you're still talking over 60% of young adults consumed alcohol in the last month, and over 10% of them are binge drinking. Well, over 40% of them are binge drinking if you're talking the young adult group. That's the most common pattern of drinking that we see actually in adolescents and young adults. The other thing that I really want to make note of, because this is huge, and it's not just people who knowingly use opioids, we're seeing a lot of opioid use, and we're seeing opioid deaths, and this is happening in adolescents as well. And this graph kind of shows you opioid deaths fanning out since 1999. And what you see is like pharmaceutical grade opioids in yellow. They've remained about the same. We started having this increase in heroin overdose deaths throughout the 2000s. And then really in the last half a decade to a decade, there's been this explosion of fentanyl overdose deaths. Fentanyl is primarily being synthetically made in China, and it gets into the United States pretty easily through the postal system. And the problem is it's very highly lethal. So you can see the comparison and how much it takes to overdose. And the fact that fentanyl is 100 times more potent than something like morphine. And the reason that you have to know about this is kids don't just get this from actually using opioids. So in Colorado, we have had overdoses in methamphetamine users who only use meth because their meth was cut with fentanyl. And we've had adolescents overdose on cannabis because their joint or their blunt included fentanyl in it, and they may not have actually known that was the case. And so we have seen fentanyl overdoses in a variety of substance use settings. It kind of made me want to go give a seminar to the drug dealers about how not to kill their clients so they can still make money, because it's just stupid to be putting fentanyl in everything, and people are unintentionally overdosing. So don't think of fentanyl just as your opioid users. You could have a kid who only does meth, a kid who only does cannabis, and they might overdose on fentanyl unintentionally.
Jesse, I know that adolescence has been determined, is that right, from 12, and then the brain stops developing at 25. So we're also talking about young adults. So why does this matter? Why is it so important to their brain development at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So kids will often tell you, my parents smoke weed, so it doesn't matter. My parents tell me it's not a big deal. And the first thing that I have to make clear to them is they're different from their parents. And the reason that they're different from their parents is because their brain is still developing. That's the biggest difference in the impact of cannabis use earlier in life compared to later in life. So when we look at the brain and we look at where are the cannabinoid receptors, where are the receptors that THC act on, what we see is they're all over the brain. So they're in the regions of the cerebral cortex involved in decision making, cognition, and emotional behavior, learning and memory systems. For those who are more athletically inclined, we can talk to them a little bit about the impact of cannabis on regulating movement, motor control, and coordination. Those types of things can also be impaired. From a psychiatric perspective, we get particularly concerned about the impact on the amygdala, which is responsible for anxiety and stress, emotion and fear, and the hippocampus involved in memory and learning. So that's a big one for teachers. Teachers want the hippocampus to be optimized and to not be impaired, so that their kids are able to form memories and learn. And then, of course, with addiction, in the substantia nigra, with reward and addiction as well. And so THC primarily acts through what is known as the endocannabinoid system. And the endocannabinoid system is detectable in human fetuses at about week 14. So really, really early in gestation, often before a woman knows she's pregnant, especially if it's like an unintentional pregnancy or a teen pregnancy. And it's very tightly regulated when and where it's expressed in the brain. Endocannabinoids are made on demand. So you can think about it like they're made and they last for seconds, and they last in a very specific region of the brain. And it's involved in every aspect of brain development. So they help determine what brain cells turn into. They help determine the types of connections that they make, which is called synaptogenesis. They help insulate them so that the conduction is electrical fast and not slow, which is what myelination does. And they determine where they go. So they help form the pathways that will actually develop in the brain. It's why kids are better at learning instruments, they're better at learning languages, because all of these brain development processes are still going on. They have an easier time making new pathways and new connections than adults do, where brain development has largely finished. And they're also responsible for the development of neurotransmitters. Serotonin is big in anxiety and depression. Dopamine is big in addiction. And so all of those things are impacted by this system. This is the one animal slide. But I show you this because this is a really, really important concept. So this was a seminal study where they took adolescent rats, and they either exposed them to THC or they did not. So the animals not exposed to THC are the gray line. The animals exposed to THC are the green line. And then they shock them. It's called a foot shock. It basically induces anxiety or stress. And what they showed is that in adolescence, when you shock the animal, all animals show increased risk of anxiety and stress, which is represented as psychiatric illness. So you can see the gray line goes up and the green line goes up. And then there's this clear break, and now these animals are allowed to grow into adulthood. They're no longer exposed to THC. So their only exposure was in adolescence, and they shock them again. And what you see is the animals that were never exposed to THC, they basically take that in stride. Their stress response, their trauma response doesn't really go up. But what you see is in these animals that were exposed to THC and as an adolescent, when their brain was developing, they shock them and their risk goes up even further. And so if you think about your own life, have you ever experienced a stressor or some event in adulthood that was much more significant than anything you ever experienced in childhood? And these kids are exposing themselves in their brains for that system to not be optimized and to not work as well, and increase their risk of something happening every time they're exposed to a stressor or a traumatic event. It is important, though, to have a little sympathy with teens. Oftentimes, I think about the teen brain as a Lamborghini that developed its gas pedal long before the brakes ever came along. I have no idea why that's the way things develop. I'm sure that'll be an interesting conversation one day on the other side of mortality as to who came up with that idea. But that's the way it develops. And so you do have to have a little sympathy for them, that the fun part has developed before the breaks. And so sometimes that's our role, is we get to help them pick up the pieces, or we get to try and educate them and help enhance their artificial braking system until it has fully developed. There are multiple changes that have been identified in brain structure as a result of cannabis use. I won't talk about these in detail, but they're the same regions of the brain we were just talking about, where the cannabinoid receptors are expressed. Memory formation and information processing, decision-making and lower IQ and executive functioning are all things that are directly applicable to schools and to education. Big ones for me are also image of self, emotional regulation. You know how hard it is to be a teenager in today's world, especially a teen girl or a member of the LGBTQ plus community, especially in middle school. That can be a brutal experience. And they can mess with the system that's helping give them their image of self and their emotional regulation. And then, of course, craving independence as well. One thing that don't go telling kids this is the part of your brain that changes. These studies are quite small typically, and they're a little bit variable. There is a much larger study that's taking place. It's called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It is a $300 million initiative where 10,000 kids are being scanned every 2 years from 9 years old all the way through adolescence to try and figure out how substance use affects brain development, but also how psychiatric conditions develop in adolescents and teens. We do know, though, that some of these brain structure changes, they do persist with abstinence. So stopping doesn't necessarily totally reverse them. And so it is important to know that it does affect the brain. The system is widely expressed throughout adolescence, and the developing brain can be greatly impacted by it.
So Jesse, that's all amazing. I do have sympathy for our kids because, right, they're trying the best they can, and having people along, like you guys alongside them, is very helpful. What are the real consequences, I guess, both mental health, physical, of cannabis use in our kids?
Yeah. So we know from earlier studies done in the 80s and 90s, there are all sorts of outcomes that people often hear about in terms of school performance, criminality, job performance, other healthy risk behaviors. And those are real concerns. But I think where the rubber is going to meet the road for teenagers and for helping understand this. So one of the consistent findings that we see in terms of functional impairments are executive functioning. So planning, sequencing, decision-making, problem solving, memory, both the formation of it or the encoding of it, as well as the retention and retrieval, the ability to recall things, can all be impacted. Concentration and attention span. We talk about how cannabis use sometimes looks like ADHD. Oftentimes kids with ADHD also use cannabis, and so there's some complexities there. But certainly concentration and attention span get affected. Again, for our athletically inclined friends, motor coordination, and being able to talk to them about, they may not care so much about some of these other academic things, but they might care about motor coordination, and they might care about, it's fractions of a second that sometimes determine people's eligibility for scholarships, and they play in high school and they're done. And then we talk about lower IQ. That's often been a huge and controversial point, but the literature that shows that there's a decrease in IQ, it's about the same effect as chronic lead exposure in kids, and we all know that chronic lead exposure is really, really bad. Yet cannabis exposure in kids doesn't carry that same kind of sense of, oh, that's really bad, that chronic lead exposure carries. And again, these types of impairments are associated with earlier age of onset, so smoking at a younger age, also the quantity and frequency with which they smoke. In terms of other things,
Jesse,
yeah.
Somebody just had a chat or a question. Can you briefly talk about THC using to help with seizures in young kids? Can you talk about that, or do you talk about that later on?
No, I'm happy to talk about that. I don't have slides specific to that. So that relates more to the medical use of cannabis than to the recreational use of cannabis. And so there are a couple of key points there. One is that THC itself, so that the primary cannabinoid that gets people high or causes the euphoric effect, really only has indications for things like anorexia or failure to thrive. Dronabinol was primarily created for like HIV patients and cancer patients, and so it's really to help stimulate an appetite. When we talk about use in seizure disorders, the medications that have been created that contain cannabinoids primarily contain CBD, pharmaceutical grade cannabidiol. And they have been pretty helpful. We do have cases of refractory seizure disorders that have had access to CBD. It was available in Colorado through the medical market long before there were any sort of pharmaceutical grade products, and parents would move here to put their kids on CBD. Charlotte's Web was a big one that's been in the news that parents would often get access to. As a physician, it's unfortunate that it was a crime for them to do what they did, but obviously it wasn't a prosecuted crime because there was prosecutorial discretion. People understood what these parents were doing. We do have a number of studies that are going on at the university that look at cannabis as a medicine. Some of them look at natural use. So there was a study looking at just marijuana use in veterans with PTSD. And some of them look at pharmaceutical grade products. But the big difference to note in your mind, a pharmaceutical grade product is typically synthetic or isolated cannabinoids. So it's usually either THC or CBD, but it's pharmaceutical grade and it's under all the regulations that the FDA puts on things. When you look at other cannabis as medicine, when they're just buying products from dispensaries, they're widely variable. And so I do think that there are going to be medical indications for cannabis. There already are for CBD and for THC in the pharmaceutical grade. But I do think you have to pay attention to those two things. So when you look at the other aspects of where could these be useful besides seizure disorders, the pharmaceutical companies have really put their money on inflammation. That's where a lot of their resources are going. In the psychiatric world, we have studies looking at CBD in neurodevelopmental disorders, so like Fragile X syndrome, autism syndrome, things like that. That's largely where we're looking at the use of these substances. THC has never been shown to be helpful for any psychiatric condition in any study that has been done. I don't know if that answered that. That was probably more than you wanted.
That was great. Thank you very much.
So the other thing that's important to know when we talk about who is going in and requiring emergency services, even though adolescents don't represent the largest group of users, they are the group that is most often hospitalized. So the numbers in Colorado, the age range is from 9 to 17 is included in that category. Basically old enough that it probably was not an accidental exposure. They knew what they were getting into. They're the most likely to get hospitalized. The most likely to be seen in the emergency department or require emergency services are those young adults aged 18 to 25. So they're not only using it at higher rates, but they also require the highest amount of hospitalizations and the highest amount of emergency services. So that's important to know and have those resources available so that you can know how to help get kids connected to those services when they need them. Obviously, driving is also a big concern. Overall, the number of adolescents that ride in a vehicle with someone who's used cannabis is unchanged. It's about 20% and has been for the last decade. However, cannabis definitely can impair driving. And driver impairment has been demonstrated at blood cannabis or THC levels as low as 2 to 5 nanograms per milliliter. So that's not a lot. Or that's about the dose of one edible. So an edible in Colorado is limited at 10 milligrams. So one edible dose is enough to impair your driving. It's estimated that if you smoke cannabis, your driving is impaired for up to 6 hours. So this is very different from alcohol use. Your driving is impaired for up to 6 hours. And if you ingest approximately 2 doses of an edible, your driving is impaired for approximately 8 hours. So kids that use edibles preferentially so that they can conceal their use, because when you look at them across the table, they're just eating gummy bears. Their driving is impaired for the next 8 hours at least. And so huge differences there. This was also something that Julie mentioned earlier, but cannabis-related lung injuries are also something that are uniquely concerning to adolescents and young adults. These largely come from vaping, and they're associated with contaminated marijuana products. So like I mentioned earlier, fentanyl has been used to cut a bunch of drugs. THC concentrates in the oil form have been cut with talcum, formaldehyde, and other substances. So, you know, formaldehyde is what we preserve cadavers with. But that gets into THC cartridges to help preserve the THC oils. There was an outbreak of EVALI, or e-vaping associated lung injuries, in the United States in 2019 that you might remember. 805 cases and 12 deaths, and that was tied to vitamin E. And so you think, well, vitamin E is a vitamin. What's that doing? But the case that Julie was referring to, the surgeon that did the surgery basically described that what he saw looked like a mustard gas attack in that kid's lungs. So it causes an acute lung injury, which what I tell teens means it's not associated with chronic use. It's not like lung cancer. It's not like emphysema or bronchitis. It's not your grandma. This affects young people. It's an acute injury. The case that I often talk about with my teens here is we had a kid at CU Boulder who grew up in the mountains. He got EVALI, lost about 30% of his lung capacity, and he can't go home without being on oxygen because he can't breathe at that altitude anymore. And so this does affect young people, and they do relate to this. They do understand there is a risk of permanent injury with vaping THC products.
Jesse, Arlene in the chat has a question which really ties in, I think, to your next points. She said, could these issues be connected to the breakdown of many individuals that society is now labeling mental health crises? So if you can address that, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. So we'll just go into talking a little bit about the impact on mental health. This is where I spend a lot of my time clinically in some of the work that we do. So there are two types of things to consider when you talk about the impact of cannabis use on mental health. The first is cannabis use is associated with a number of mental health things. And then it may cause some mental health things. And those two types of statements are different, but the reality is that you often see cannabis use or other substance use and mental health together. So there are a number of associations between the two. So anxiety disorders and long-term, people will tell you they use cannabis because it helps their anxiety. And what we know clinically is long-term, their anxiety actually gets worse because of their cannabis use. There's cannabis-induced psychosis, the risk of schizophrenia, and the risk of bipolar disorder. Those are a little bit different from anxiety and depression, where cannabis, specifically THC, actually seems to be able to interact with their biology and cause these symptoms to manifest. Kind of like a fever can cause a seizure in kids, cannabis can cause mania and psychosis in people that have the biologic risk for that to be able to happen. And we also know that patients that have cannabis use or other problematic substance use are at higher risk of suicide. It's actually one of the few things that can be used to predict who has ideas of suicide versus those who actually attempt. So problematic substance use is a big red flag in terms of the risk of suicide attempt. We actually just completed an analysis in a national database, a national survey, looking at the risk of depression and suicide in adolescents who have ever used cannabis. And we're going to be publishing that. Hopefully, we'll be submitting it next month. Hopefully, it will come out this year. But basically, the risk of severe depression is about 3 times higher in kids that smoke or that use cannabis. And the risk of suicide attempt is about 7 times higher. And so we're not talking little risks associated with cannabis use. These are pretty significant increases. We also know that kids that have cannabis use or other problematic substance use tend to have poorer outcomes. So specifically, when you look at something like comorbid schizophrenia, they have lower levels of functioning, shorter periods of time where they're adherent to medications, and they tend to relapse quicker in their disorder. Specifically to adolescents and young adults, When you look at those who come into the emergency department for a cannabis-related encounter, there's a 5-fold higher prevalence of mental health. So what that means is it's 5 times more likely if someone is there for cannabis that they have a mental health disorder than if they're not there for cannabis. The prevalence of schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum disorders is about 9 times higher in those with cannabis, and self-inflicted injury is about 8 times higher. And then about 30% of adolescents and 80% of those actually entering treatment have comorbid psychiatric conditions. And so as a general rule of thumb, if someone has problematic cannabis use enough that you're noticing that it's a problem, odds are pretty high that they have something else, whether it's depression or anxiety or a trauma disorder or ADHD. It's pretty likely that they have something else. And all of those things are going to interact and complicate their treatment course. Cannabis-induced psychosis is something that you may have heard something about. This is, to me as a clinician, probably the scariest thing that we see with any sort of cannabis use. And so you do have to acknowledge the majority of individuals who use marijuana are not going to develop signs and symptoms of psychosis. However, some will, and we're not good at predicting who that's going to be. The highest vulnerability is those with family risk. So if you have a family history of schizophrenia, I tell those kids, or bipolar disorder, I tell those kids it's not, you're rolling the dice. It's probably not worth it. If they personally have a history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, not worth it. But we also have people who become floridly psychotic that have no family history and have no personal history whatsoever. Primary risk factors are THC potency. So high potency THC is a big risk factor. The duration of time that they've used and the age at which they start using. So kids who start at a younger age, who use more frequently with high dose THC, they have the highest risk, and they have poorer clinical outcomes. The reason that this is what scares me the most as a clinician is because the brain is still developing. We have some teens who go on to fully recover and they never have another episode if they never use THC again. We have some kids that this becomes the onset, and that often can look like actually a traumatic brain injury. I have a teen right now that I treat, and he's 3 months out from his psychotic episode and has not fully regained his functioning, but the psychosis has stopped. And so it can look like a traumatic brain injury. We have kids that this is the beginning of another disorder like bipolar or schizophrenia. And then unfortunately, we've now had a handful of kids who never get better. So they've been in locked facilities in one case for 3 years. Every medication has failed. And this kid is still psychotic and has not had access to marijuana in 3 years. To give you an idea of his baseline functioning, he was a star football player that was on his way to a D1 scholarship in high school. It's a very, very sad case. So that's what scares me the most. But what you're going to see a lot of in your schools and in your communities is actually kids with trauma. And substance use, trauma is the great wild card. And part of that is because those two disorders have a profound bidirectional relationship and they interact with each other. So I'll just give you one example of a cyclical pattern that we often see. And this happens a lot with alcohol, can happen with cannabis and other things, but you have, they use to self-medicate. So they're trying to manage these intrusive symptoms, the hyperarousal, the problems with sleep, and then they withdraw. And when they withdraw, it looks a lot like their trauma symptoms. So they have trouble sleeping. They start feeling hyper-aroused again. They start feeling more anxious. And because that mimics their trauma symptoms, they use again. And so they get in this reinforcing cycle where it becomes vicious. And they're constantly using and withdrawing and having an exacerbation of the trauma, and using and withdrawing and having an exacerbation of their trauma. And so particularly with kids with trauma, you really have to have a soft spot in your heart to understand that finding the balance between treating their trauma and treating their substance use is really challenging, because especially early on, when you're pulling them away from one, you're inherently making the other worse. And so you really have to find a way to strike that balance and support them through that, so that they have a real shot at getting sober.
Well, in saying that, Jesse, can you give us any tips on how to talk to our kids, whether they're our own kids in the schools, in the communities that we live in. We all have kids we care about. So how do we have these, we know that it does matter if you have that conversation. So how do we start?
Yeah. So the first thing is, and this may sound a little silly or a little tongue in cheek, but the first thing is to talk with them, but don't talk at them. You're going to lose kids, especially when it comes to marijuana or other substance use, if you start talking at them. So one thing to know is, as a teacher or a trusted adult, if a kid comes to you with a problem, they already know they have a problem. They already know they did something wrong. So you can skip the stage of telling them that they did something wrong. They got that part figured out. So some tips for talking with teens, especially about this topic. One is to stop and listen. So actually listen to them. Stop what you're doing, look at them, pay attention, and be present in the conversation. Be empathetic and emotionally responsive. Ask questions. Repeat things so that you show them that you can hear them and you're understanding them. If someone is repeating this, and this is true, this works with your boss too, by the way. If someone is repeating the same thing time after time after time, if you show them that you heard them by reflecting what they said and saying, so what you're saying is X, Y, Z, they'll often move on. They often repeat things because they don't think you've heard what they've said. And so it can be really important to show them, I hear you. But more important than showing them that you hear them or giving them the answer is helping identify their emotion and helping them sit with their emotion. That's what they often struggle with the most. You may not know how to help them. It's okay to ask, because in the end, they're the ones that have to make the change. You can't force them to do any of this. When it's a safety thing, or you have to set a clear expectation because they're using at school or whatever, be authoritative and set clear expectations and boundaries. Don't leave gray zones. And learn and adapt. What works for one kid may not work for another. And eventually we're all going to do something that worked for no kid whatsoever. But we ended up doing it anyway because it was a bad day or we weren't thinking. So it's okay to learn and adapt along the way. Where parents and adults get into a lot of trouble is with what I call empathy busters. So these are things that will shut kids down instantly. What we're notoriously bad at is giving unsolicited advice. So analyzing, diagnosing, educating, correcting, all of these types of things that are unsolicited for them. I think you should do this. Those are all things that can shut kids down right away. The other big group is dismissing. So that includes minimizing them. It's not a big deal. It'll be okay. One-upping, that's nothing. Shutting them down. Don't worry. Don't feel bad. Let's go get ice cream. Denying the way that they feel. I'm very sarcastic, and I have to pay attention to the fact that sarcasm can also be an empathy buster for a lot of teens, and just being careful not to be sarcastic and show them that you're taking them seriously. And so things that typically don't work are you're fine, brush it off. It's not a big deal. Why are you all crying anyway? Don't worry about it. Stop overreacting. The types of things that my mom used to say, whenever you would come running in and crying, the question was always, is someone bleeding or is the house on fire? That was kind of the threshold. Things that, this is more specific to depression or crying, but things that it just gives a great example of the way to think about how you say things. It's okay to be sad. This is really hard for you. I'm here for you. Tell me about it. I'll help you work it out. I'm listening. So oftentimes, especially with teens with something like cannabis-induced psychosis, where we don't have a lot of clinical knowledge yet, I own that with them. And I tell them, we don't know everything about this, but what I can promise you is we're going to work on it together and we're going to figure it out. Especially in the school setting, it's really important. And I think we often forget to do this stage. When we're screening for substance use and someone's not using, we kind of just move on and we go, okay, that's one thing I don't have to deal with. It's really important to take that 30 seconds and praise that kid for not using and help them understand that the majority of their peers are also not using, and that there are risks associated with using. And if they ever want to ask questions about it, they're welcome to come back and ask you questions. So don't take that opportunity to teach them about substance use off the table just because they're not using. But couch it a little bit differently. Don't lecture them, praise them, and then say there are risks. And if you do want to ever talk about it, I'm happy to share some stuff with you. This quote's from an ethicist, Michael Josephson, but I think it's really applicable to that question. Instead of putting people in their place, put yourself in their place. Empathy and understanding is the medicine that will cure what ails us. To be able to talk to adolescents about substance use, especially cannabis use, you have to be prepared. You have to know what you're talking about. They will call you out. And this was a lesson a lot of people learned early on the hard way, particularly in Colorado, where they went beyond what the science shows and beyond what we know and how they talk to teens, and they instantly lost their credibility. And teens were like, you're full of crap. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. Teens have read a lot. They know these things, but they also want information. That's why they're reading. So the National Institute on Drug Abuse has a website just for teens. It's at teens.drugabuse.gov. And they provide resources that target teens. So this is not government or research forums that are in my type of language. These are resources for teens in their language designed to be appealing to them. There are also resources that you can order, and they'll deliver these booklets to you. You can have them in your office or in your classroom. Drugs Shatter the Myths, Marijuana Facts for Teens are two of them. There are also online versions that you can download the PDF and you can email them to people. And so it's really important, I think, to keep that in mind. Have resources available. Make sure that you know what you're talking about. Teens will call you out if you overstep what we know. And so that's the extent of what I have to share. I know we're going to have a little bit more discussion today, but please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about anything.
Thanks so much, Jesse. Julie, what else can we do to help spread this important messaging for our kids and communities in our schools?
I'm just blown away every time I hear Dr. Hinckley speak. It's just full of great information that's applicable to everyday conversations. And like you said, kids, don't BS a kid, because they recognize that a mile away. But I'm somebody that gets information, gets data, and then really wants to act. So one of the ways that we are partnering with schools, One Chance to Grow Up, is this marijuana free zone. So we created this campaign as a direct result of Denver's 2021 allowance for public cannabis consumption, as well as marijuana delivery, like Uber Eats. They approved that as well. So this campaign allows places of businesses and schools to identify themselves as a marijuana-free zone, as a safe place for communities, a place that teaches young kids great habits, and it's a promise of protecting our kids from unhealthy consequences of THC. So as the law is written right now, and it kind of has, not much has happened with it because it just got kind of went into practice right around COVID. So no one's creating these social consumption areas. But how it is why it matters, and I was explaining this to Kym the other day, is you could have a yoga studio or a bookstore or a smoothie shop that looks like is a legitimate business, but could also be having a social consumption club in the back. So we're just wanting to be transparent and let everyone know that this is, your community knows. So this is a very exciting initiative. We have all the Boys and Girls Club in Colorado came on board last summer, and then DPS came on board as well. So this decal is in 207 middle and high schools in DPS in Denver Public Schools, as well as all 64 clubs across the state. So, and Boys and Girls Clubs. So we are, the momentum is building. We have several San Luis Valley schools that are jumping on board. Just like yesterday, I heard from Delta, as well as Mountain Valley. So we're very excited. We would love your partnership in this. It is a no-cost initiative to you. We have these decals made up. I think they're like 4x6. We'd love to have them in every entrance point in your schools, whether it's a single school or a district. So we would love that. So you can either put your information in the chat and I can gather that, or please email me at julie@onechance2growup. And we would love to have your, like I said, the schools joining in this. I know schools are all automatically drug and alcohol free zones, but this just is a positive way to re-emphasize that this is a healthy habit for all of our kids. So again, we would love to talk with you. Thank you, Donna. I will get you some for your restaurant. Email me, Julie at One Chance to Grow Up, or so here we are, like the Chaffey County, which Kym just told me yesterday has one of the highest substance use abuse rates. Is that teen or just across the board? Adolescent abuse rates in the country. So we actually sent that picture out. I made it into a holiday card from One Chance to Grow Up and sent it to all our donors and foundations, because how can you not love that card? It's just so happy. And then I spoke at North High School back in December, and they had it on the doors, and several middle schools too. So it's an exciting, it's a positive initiative, and we'd love to have you as one of our partners. Thank you all.
So should we open it up for questions for Dr. Hinckley or for Julie? You can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat.
While people are thinking, I see that Arlene already put a comment in about why so many adolescents are committing crimes. There's some complicated research about the impact of substance use on that. And so there's a lot of epidemiologic research, sociologic research from the 80s and 90s that show higher crime rates among teens that use cannabis and other substances. The question that's always been out there that we don't know is it because of their substance use, or is it because people who use substances are more likely to do those things? And we don't know that, but there are a lot of pressures. It's a very complicated issue. So definitely teens that use substances put themselves in situations where they're more likely to be involved in violence. And they're also, in some cases, having to commit illegal acts to be able to maintain their substance use behaviors. And some of them, quite frankly, are just being trafficked. And so trafficked can be sexual in nature. It can also be other in nature, where they're being forced to deal illegal drugs, or they're being forced to do other things. And I've had foster kids who have been trafficked in that way. And it's hard to get out because they're told they'll be killed or their family will be killed. And so I have been warned by foster kids that I might have a gunman show up at my door because they figured out that that's where they're living. And so some of it is probably due to the deviance, just related to the fact that they're doing something illegal. But that doesn't make them bad. I think that's important to know. A kid who commits a crime is not necessarily a bad kid. There is a much higher rate of what's called oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder among kids who use substances. So that's part of it as well. And then I think, especially with COVID, we don't have a good pulse on gang violence right now. And I think that we definitely are seeing an uptick in gang violence in certain areas of the country, probably here in our metro area as well.
Could you please go back to the slide that said strategies to do instead of what not to do? I think it was like that little poster.
You mean the stuff that my mother always said and Jesse's mother always said, and that what we're not supposed to say?
Yes, that one. And you, again, yes, if you missed it, we will share the recording and the slide deck. So you will get this, and you'll have Julie and Dr. Hinckley's email addresses as well.
And we'll also share some resources that we share, like the NIDA resources. We'll have those links as well. So those are easy accessible.
And Lori, the big point here is not so much the right words as much as it is the right sentiment. And so helping adolescents identify the emotion that they're experiencing. For the guys in the audience, this will also get you a lot further with your significant others, rather than focusing on what's actually happening. If you help them understand, yeah, you're really upset, and that's okay. Sometimes that's what they need, more than you trying to intervene or correct it or fix it or get rid of it or whatever else. And so the take-home message is really help them identify and label their emotion and accept it. That's okay to experience that emotion. Everybody experiences sadness and anger at some point, and then let them know that you're going to help them.
Which are some of the basic tenets of social emotional learning. Are there any other questions for Julie or Dr. Hinckley today?
Arlene made the point that teachers may be their closest comfort. So I will tell you, in the child and adolescent psychiatry world, one of our biggest fears in COVID has been that there are a lot of mental health and a lot of abuse situations that aren't getting picked up because teachers are not in these kids' daily lives right now. So that's been a big fear of ours. And it's part of what has led to this mental health crisis in adolescents being declared in the United States.
Yeah.
Looks like Nick has a question.
Yeah, first off, thank you. All of that was really fantastic, to say the least. I was curious, so like, I think this slide really shows it where, you know, building trust with kids and that interpersonal relationship is probably going to be the best way of, you know, getting them to talk about this and sit with their emotions. But I'm curious if in your experience, you've worked with any schools or organizations that have done a good job of being proactive in ways of getting kids to talk about these things. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would say if you don't create a space and an opportunity, kids aren't going to talk about these things. And so having resources available. So in some school districts like Denver Public Schools, that looks like having school-based health clinics in most of their major schools, and having substance use counselors and mental health providers in those clinics. So they've created a space where kids can talk to them. But I think if your kids know, if you can have some way of signaling to them that they know that you're a safe person to talk to and that you will help them. So that may be something that you can associate with like the marijuana free zone sticker that you could put it up in your classroom. And then when you put it up, you could point out to your kids, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I'm always here. If you ever need to talk about any of this, have any questions or concerns, I want to be here to help you. And so the key is you have to create a non-judgmental space and they have to know it exists.
Perfect. Thank you.
We also see teaching and helping students develop a social emotional learning tool belt is very helpful because it gives them coping strategies, helps them make better decisions, and build healthy relationships, especially as Dr. Hinckley was talking about, you know, in that safe space. Ellen, can you go to the GSN slide? So GSN has a K-12 curriculum that teaches the skills that I just mentioned. And we have over 30 units on SEL core competencies, which are all CASEL aligned. So GSN is available to provide some of these resources to you. We have some for free, some for purchase. We come alongside schools and help them with professional development or coaching or evaluation as well.
I really want to, as a clinician, pitch something to reinforce that. Julie kind of joked when we were chatting on Zoom before this started if I was going to tell everybody to just say no. And the reality is a lot of those prevention strategies that we grew up with, they don't work. That's why they don't exist anymore. And what we're now learning from prevention research, prevention is actually less about giving kids information and telling them not to do drugs. And it's more about giving them the skills to deal with everything in their lives and putting them in a situation where they're less likely to choose to do drugs and to have the skills to refuse them. And so a lot of the best prevention programs are now skills-based programs. I mean, they're pro-social programs, but they're not have the cop and the drug dog show up and tell people don't, and this is your brain on drugs. Kids just didn't respond to that, but they respond to this skills building and the pro-social stuff.
Our time is about over today. Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you so much, Dr. Hinckley, for sharing. Before you get off, please give us the feedback. Tell us how we did, so we can be better next time. If you have any further questions, reach out to any of us. Our emails are all on the slide deck. So yeah, my mind is just full of so much information to digest. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm excited about all the ways that we can support our students through this. Thank you.